5 days before it plans to give the whole thing away for free, the hottest OpenAI model on the planet ran out of GPUs. That is not a headline anyone expected. A few days ago, we brought you a deep dive on Kimi K3, the 2.8 trillion parameter open model from Beijing's Moonshot AI that shook chip stocks the moment it landed. Today is the sequel. Because in the 72 hours after that launch, the story did not settle down, it exploded. The servers buckled. The valuation leapt again. The Western labs blinked. The skeptics showed up with cold water. And Washington started reaching for the one lever that may no longer work. Welcome back to a special AI Daily Deep Dive. One story, all the way down. What happened next? Let us start with the moment that turned into an omen. On Sunday, July 19th, just 3 days after launch, Moonshot AI did something a company riding a global hype wave almost never does. It stopped selling. The company posted that, quote, Kimi K3 has received far more love than we expected, and our GPUs are feeling it. Over the past 48 hours, demand has pushed close to the limits of our current capacity. So Moonshot paused new subscriptions. Existing subscribers were not affected, and the company said it would reopen new spots in batches while it adds capacity, and split its plans into a general Kimi membership and a separate Kimi code membership to better match compute to demand. Sit with the irony for a second. This is a model whose entire pitch is that anyone will soon be able to download it and run it themselves, and the demand to use Moonshot's own hosted version was so intense the company had to slam the door on new customers. The open-weight strategy just collided with the physical reality of GPUs. How much demand are we talking about? The exact numbers are private, but the signals are loud. Reports around the pause describe daily sales climbing several-fold since the model went live, and Moonshot's business had already been growing fast before K3. Bloomberg-sourced reporting says the startup's annual recurring revenue roughly doubled to about $200 million by April, up from around $100 million in March, and multiple outlets say it has kept climbing since the K3 launch. Whatever the precise figure, the shape is clear. A company that a year and a half ago was a research lab is now scaling like a consumer hit and running into the same wall every AI company hits: not enough chips. That wall is exactly why the next part of the story is about money, a lot of it. In our first deep dive, we told you Moonshot was reportedly in talks seeking a valuation of around $30 billion. 3 days later, that number already looks stale. According to Bloomberg-sourced reporting, Moonshot is now finalizing a round that would value it at more than $30 billion and is preparing a further pre-IPO round as soon as August, targeting a valuation of up to $50 billion. 50. For a company that was worth around $4.3 billion in December, that is a nearly 7-fold jump in about half a year. And if the August round lands where reports suggest, the climb is even steeper. This is what a benchmark-topping open model does to a cap table. It does not just win developers, it rewrites the price investors are willing to pay overnight. And the endgame is now visible: a public listing. Reports say Moonshot is preparing to list on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, potentially within 6 months and possibly before the end of the year, with Goldman Sachs and China International Capital Corporation lined up as advisors. To make that happen, the company is reportedly dismantling its offshore holding structure by the end of July to qualify under Hong Kong and mainland rules. Put the pieces together and a pattern emerges. This is not just a lab shipping a good model. It is a company converting a single viral launch into a capital markets event, funding round, IPO prep, and infrastructure build-out, all firing at once. K3 is the product. But the real machine being built here is a company that intends to be too big and too public to ignore. So how did the Western leaders react once the dust started to settle? Not with silence. First, the market did some brutal math on their behalf. One analysis estimated that the K3 shock erased over $300 billion in implied pre-IPO value from OpenAI and Anthropic combined, with OpenAI's estimated valuation marked down by tens of billions in a single stretch, and NVIDIA shedding around $111 billion of market value on the worst day. Those private company figures are estimates, not audited prices, so hold them loosely. But the direction was unmistakable, and it forced a response. Reporting this week describes OpenAI and Anthropic moving to adjust access and defend their pricing in the face of a rival charging a fraction of the rate, the exact competitive pressure a cheap, capable challenger is supposed to create. But the incumbents did not only play defense, they punched back with an argument. Dean Ball, who leads strategic work at OpenAI, made a pointed case that K3's cheap sticker price may be misleading. It is, quote, not obvious to me that this model is actually that cheap to run, he argued, because K3 leans on always-on reasoning and can burn through enormous numbers of tokens even on simple tasks, and you pay per token. In other words, the price per million tokens is low, but if the model uses 3 times as many tokens to finish the job, the bill on your actual task may not be as small as the headline suggests. This is the most substantive rebuttal on the table, and it echoes a real caveat we flagged in our first episode. The counterargument is now the whole ballgame. Is K3 genuinely cheaper in practice, or only on paper? That question is precisely what the skeptics picked up next. The most quoted cold water take came from Ethan Malik, the Wharton professor who has become one of the most read voices on real-world AI use. His verdict, in short, this is not a deep-seek moment. Kimi is, quote, a very good model, he wrote, but it is roughly where I would expect on the curve, rather than an unexpected leap. His sharper point was about how the hype got made. A lot of swift conclusions, he warned, are being drawn about Kimi K3 based on fairly saturated benchmarks and yellow scores, rather than actually testing it on very hard problems. Translation: when every top model already scores in the 90s on a test, small gaps at the top stop meaning much, and a model that is genuinely good but still a few months behind the frontier can look like the future to people who only read the leaderboard. That is not a dismissal of K3. It is a warning about reading too much into a scoreboard. The technical skeptics zeroed in on how the scores were made. The core complaint: at launch, nearly every benchmark number came from Moonshot's own reporting, and the model was tested under different agent harnesses than its rivals, and harness choice alone can swing a score by several points. At least one independent evaluator held off ranking K3 entirely, citing methodology differences and the fact that the open weights are not out yet, so no one else can fully reproduce the runs. But, to be fair to K3, not every expert thinks the results are inflated. Mikhail Bakker, a researcher affiliated with Google DeepMind and MIT, argued the model's strong showing seems impossible to explain through distillation alone, pushing back on the lazy assumption that a Chinese model this good must have simply copied Western ones. So the honest state of play is this: K3 is clearly capable, clearly real, and clearly not yet independently verified at the level of the hype. All three things are true at once, and the tiebreaker arrives on July 27th. Now to the stocks, because this is where the sequel diverges most from the launch day panic. To be clear, what follows is fact, not investment advice. In our first episode, the story was a broad sell-off. A few days later, using live market data through July 21st, the picture has split in two. The American megacaps largely shrugged it off. NVIDIA is actually up over the prior 10 days. Apple has climbed several percent, and Japan's SoftBank is roughly flat, having recovered from its launch day drop. But the pain that concentrated in memory chips has not healed. Over that same window, South Korea's SK Hynix is still down around 16% and Samsung around 12%, while Taiwan Semiconductor is off a couple of percent. Read carefully. That split tells a story. The market's fear was never really that the world needs less compute. It was a narrower bet against the specific companies most exposed to a cheaper model memory-heavy shift, and even that bet is being relitigated day by day. While markets sorted themselves out, the story moved to Washington, and this may be the most consequential new twist of all. According to reporting from Axios and others, the Trump administration is reportedly reviving a push to restrict Americans' use of Chinese AI models, with Kimi K3 named as the catalyst and cybersecurity cited as the rationale. The options on the table reportedly include cybersecurity advisories to discourage adoption, procurement rules that bar the federal government from using Chinese models, placing Moonshot on the Commerce Department's entity list, and executive orders that push liability onto U.S. companies that build on these systems. David Sachs, the White House AI czar, has publicly framed the stakes in stark terms, warning that the United States risks losing the AI race if open Chinese models win developer mindshare. The debate that our first episode described as a background tension has, in a matter of days, moved to the center of policy. But here is the paradox at the heart of it, the one that makes this different from a chip ban. You can restrict a physical object. A chip has to be manufactured, shipped, and installed, and every step is a checkpoint. You cannot easily restrict a file that anyone, anywhere, can copy in seconds. Once Moonshot publishes the K3 weights on July 27th, as promised, the model can be mirrored, downloaded, and rehosted around the world within hours, and no entity list or executive order undownloads a file that is already on 10,000 hard drives. Analysts across the political spectrum have made this same point this week. A meaningful technical ban on a publicly downloadable model is not really plausible. The tools Washington has, procurement bans, advisories, pressure, can shape who officially uses K3 inside the United States, but they cannot put the weights back in the box, which sets up the single most important thing to watch. So what should you watch from here? 3 things, and they all converge on one date. First, July 27th, still the release day for the full K3 weights, but now with a ban debate hanging over it. Watch whether Moonshot ships on time, and the moment it does, watch the independent benchmarks. That is when the world can finally test every self-reported number on the same harnesses and settle whether the skeptics or the believers were right. Second, the money and the machines. Watch whether that reported funding round closes toward a $50 billion valuation, whether the Hong Kong IPO advances, and whether Moonshot can actually add enough GPU capacity to reopen the doors it just closed. And third, the response. Watch whether Washington acts before the weights are irretrievable, and how OpenAI and Anthropic compete on the thing that now matters most, not the benchmark score, but the real cost of getting real work done. The launch was the earthquake. What we watched this week were the aftershocks, and they are still coming. We will be here for July 27th. If you want the verdict the moment the weights drop, subscribe. That is our sequel on Kimi K3. In 72 hours, an open Model 2 popular to keep selling. A valuation reportedly sprinting toward $50 billion, a Hong Kong IPO taking shape. The Western labs forced to defend both their prices and their gates. A skeptics chorus asking whether cheap on paper means cheap in practice, and a government reaching for a lever that a downloadable file may have already broken. The launch rewrote the map. This week rewrote the timeline. And the one date that decides how much of it holds is now just days away. We will be watching July 27th, and we will bring you the verdict the moment the weights are out. For more single-topic deep dives, subscribe, and we will see you on the next AI Daily.